She was 18 and a mother, cast out into the teeth of a Wyoming winter with a newborn son wrapped in the only good blanket she owned. She had no family left to her, no money and no plan. Just a small carving knife in her pocket and the fierce, quiet resolve of a person with nothing more to lose. And with that resolve, she found a collapsed creek bank and began to dig. But what nobody knew, least of all her, was that buried deep in the frozen earth was a secret left by a lonely man a generation before. A secret that would allow her not just to survive a winter that killed 40 men, but to build a life from the frozen dirt itself. This is the story of Elspeth and her son, and how they found a home in the most unforgiving of places. Elspeth was born in the autumn of 1878, the third child and only daughter of Martha and Josiah Kane. Their homestead was a hard place, carved from the unforgiving soil of the high plains, where the wind blew without cease, and the winters came down from the north like a judgment. Josiah was a man of severe and unbending faith, a man who saw God not in mercy but in hardship, and he ruled his family with the same iron will he used to break the land. Martha was his echo, a woman worn smooth by work and scripture, her kindnesses small and infrequent, like wildflowers in a rock field. Elspeth grew up in a world of straight lines and hard surfaces, the rigid rows of corn, the sharp angle of the church steeple, the unyielding wooden pew where she sat for hours on Sundays, listening to her father's lay sermons on providence and damnation. She learned early that silence was a virtue and that questions were a form of pride. She was a quiet child, observant and self-contained, with a stillness about her that was often mistaken for obedience. While her brothers were taught to work the fields, she was taught the endless, circular tasks of the house, mending, churning, baking, scrubbing. But her spirit lived elsewhere, in the vast, untamed prairie that stretched beyond their fences. It was there she met Silas Blackwood. He was an old man, a trapper and a widower, who lived alone in a small sod and timber dugout a few miles up the creek. The other homesteaders considered him half wild, a relic of an older time. But to Elspeth, he was a teacher. She would slip away from her chores, drawn to the thin curl of smoke from his chimney. He never asked why she came, and she never offered an explanation. He simply accepted her presence, as he accepted the presence of the deer that came to drink from his spring. Silas taught her a different kind of scripture, the one written in the tracks of animals, the bend of the willow, the color of the evening sky. He taught her how to read the land, to know which berries were safe and which roots held medicine. He showed her how to set a snare that was both effective and humane, how to skin a rabbit with a few deft strokes, and how to tan the hide until it was soft as velvet. He taught her the language of the knife, not as a weapon, but as a tool of creation and survival. From a block of cottonwood, he would show her how to carve the shape of a bird so precisely that it seemed it might take flight. He gave her a small knife of her own, its blade forged from an old file, its handle made of polished elk horn. "A good tool is an honest friend," he told her, his voice rough as bark. "It will never lie to you." That knife became her most treasured possession, a small, secret piece of a world that had nothing to do with her father's God. It was a connection to a man who saw not a daughter to be molded, but a person to be taught. Silas died quietly in his sleep during the winter of her 16th year, and she mourned him with a silent, aching grief that she could show to no one. The young man's name was Thomas, and he came with a survey crew mapping a new line for the railroad. He was full of easy laughter and stories of cities she could barely imagine, and for a few short months in the summer of her 17th year, he brought a startling, brilliant color to her monochrome world. He saw the girl who hid behind the quiet daughter, and he spoke to her not of duty, but of dreams. He did not see sin in her curiosity, only intelligence. He did not see willfulness in her silence, only strength. In a world that had demanded she be small and contained, he made her feel expansive. They met in secret in the cottonwood grove by the creek, the same place she had once met Silas, and there she gave him her heart. When the survey crew moved on at the end of the season, he promised he would come back for her. He never did. Perhaps he never intended to, or perhaps misfortune found him on the trail west. She never knew. What she did know, as autumn faded into the gray stillness of winter, was that she was carrying his child. She hid it for as long as she could, her body's betrayal a terrifying secret beneath the loose fabric of her winter dresses. But life cannot be hidden forever. Her son, Samuel, was born in the last week of September, a small, perfect creature whose first cries shattered the rigid silence of the Kane household forever. The judgment was as swift and cold as the first winter storm. There was no shouting, no debate. Her father, Josiah, did not see a daughter in need of comfort or a grandson in need of shelter. He saw only the stain of sin upon his house. To him, mercy was a weakness, a concession to the devil. His duty was clear, laid out in the unbending text of his faith. The day after Samuel was born, while Elspeth was still weak and bleeding, her mother came into her room. Martha did not meet her daughter's eyes. She simply placed a folded bundle of clothes on the bed, along with a loaf of bread, a small piece of salted beef, and the one thick wool blanket they owned. "Your father says you are to be gone by sunrise," she said, her voice flat and empty, the words delivered like stones. There was no cruelty in her tone, but no warmth either. It was the voice of a woman who had long ago surrendered her own heart to her husband's will. Elspeth did not plead or argue. She knew the futility of it. Arguing with her father was like reasoning with a hailstorm. She simply nodded, a deep, cold stillness settling over her. She spent the night holding her son, memorizing the shape of the room she had known her entire life, the slant of moonlight on the floorboards, the familiar scent of lye soap and dried herbs. She was not just being sent away, she was being erased. At first light, she rose and dressed herself and the baby. She wrapped Samuel tightly in the wool blanket, his small body a warm, precious weight against her own. She put the bread and beef into a canvas sack, along with the only other things that were truly hers: the horn-handled knife from Silas, and a small tin of salve she had made herself from pine pitch and herbs, another of the old trapper's lessons. She walked out of the house without looking back. Her father was waiting by the gate, his face a mask of grim righteousness. He did not speak to her. He simply pointed toward the open prairie, a gesture of final, absolute banishment. He had already packed her small trunk from the attic, containing a few more pieces of clothing and a worn Bible, and set it just outside the property line. He watched as she picked it up, her movements slow and deliberate. She settled the trunk on one shoulder, held her swaddled son in the crook of her other arm, and began to walk. She walked away from the only home she had ever known, a home that had never truly felt like hers, and headed west, toward the distant, hazy line of the mountains, with no destination in mind, only a powerful, instinctual pull away from the place of her unmaking. The wind was cold and sharp, and it carried the first hard flakes of snow. She walked for 3 days, the landscape growing wilder and more broken as she entered the foothills. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, cut by deep ravines and dotted with stands of pine and juniper. The cold was a constant physical presence, a thing that seeped into her bones. At night, she would find what shelter she could, a rocky overhang, a thicket of brush, and build a small, smoky fire. She would nurse Samuel, his small, warm mouth a fierce anchor in a world that had turned cold and vast. She ate sparingly, making the bread and beef last, and drank from the icy streams she crossed. Her world shrank to the essential. The next step, the next feeding, the next fire. The physical hardship was immense, but in a strange way, it was clarifying. Out here, there was no judgment, only the stark, honest reality of survival. The wind did not care about her sin. The snow did not care about her shame. They were simple, powerful truths, and she found she could meet them with a strength she did not know she possessed. The skills Silas had taught her, once a secret rebellion, were now the very tools of her existence. She noticed the way the pines grew thicker on the north-facing slopes, offering better shelter from the wind. She saw the tracks of a snowshoe hare and knew where to look for its burrow. These small, practical certainties were a comfort, a language she understood in a world that had ceased to make sense. On the fourth day, as a heavier snow began to fall, she stumbled upon a creek nestled in a deep, narrow valley. It was sheltered from the worst of the wind, and its banks were lined with a thick growth of cottonwoods and willows, their bare branches offering a latticework of protection. The south-facing bank was a steep wall of earth and stone, nearly 20 feet high. And there, about halfway up, she saw it. A dark hollow, a slump in the earth that suggested a partial collapse. It looked like an old animal den, or perhaps something more. Curiosity and a desperate need for real shelter drove her to investigate. She secured Samuel in a makeshift sling, scrambled up the frozen bank, and peered inside. The opening was small, but it led to a space that had clearly been dug out by human hands long ago. Most of it had caved in, filled with years of dirt and debris, but the back wall, braced by the thick roots of an ancient cottonwood tree, remained intact. It was a ruin, a forgotten hole in the earth. But to Elspeth, it was a promise. It was shelter. It was a place to stop walking. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this was where they would make their stand against the winter. She had no tools but her hands and Silas's small knife, but she had a purpose. She set her son down in a sheltered nook, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and began to dig. The work was brutal. The ground was frozen solid for the first several inches, and she had to chip away at it with the point of her knife, her fingers quickly growing numb and raw. Once she broke through the frost layer, the soil beneath was softer, a mix of dirt and clay that she could scoop out with her hands. For days, she worked with a single-minded intensity, her body fueled by a dwindling supply of food and an inexhaustible well of maternal desperation. Each night, she would retreat into the shallow space she had cleared, build a small fire near the entrance for warmth, and hold Samuel close, his steady breathing a quiet rhythm against the howling of the wind. She was hollowing out a life for them, one handful of dirt at a time. The space grew slowly. First, it was just a cramped cavern, barely large enough for them to lie down in. Then, day by day, it deepened and widened, until it was a small, womb-like room, about 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep. The ceiling was low, just high enough for her to sit up straight, and the back wall was a solid mass of earth and thick, woody roots. She used her knife to smooth the walls and carve small niches into the clay for holding a candle or her tin of salve. She gathered dry grasses and pine boughs to make a thick, insulated bed on the floor. It was a burrow, a den, a primitive and elemental shelter, but it was theirs. It was the first home that had ever truly belonged to her. One afternoon, as she was deepening the back of the burrow, her makeshift shovel, a flat piece of shale, struck something hard and square. It wasn't a rock. The sound was a dull, hollow thud. Her heart quickened. She cleared the dirt away carefully, her fingers tracing the outline of a rotting wooden box, about the size of a small trunk. It was wedged deep into the earth, almost hidden behind one of the large cottonwood roots. It took her the better part of an hour to pry it loose from the grip of the earth and the roots. The wood was soft and punky with age, and the iron hinges were rusted nearly through. With a final effort, she broke the lock and lifted the lid. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside, nestled in what was once a canvas lining, was a collection of objects that seemed to glow in the dim light of her burrow. There was a heavy leather pouch, cinched tight with a drawstring. She opened it, and a stream of dull yellow gold dust and a handful of small, lumpy nuggets poured into her palm. It was more wealth than she had ever seen or imagined. Beside the pouch lay a small, oilskin-wrapped package. She unwrapped it to find a stack of old banknotes, still crisp, and a small, tarnished silver locket. Finally, at the bottom of the box was a letter, a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with wax. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and careful, the ink faded but still legible. It was dated August 1852. "To whoever finds this," it began. "My name is Elias Vance. I built this place to wait for my wife, Anna, and our son, Jacob, who were to follow me from Ohio. I came west to find gold and make a place for them. I found some, as you can see, enough for a small farm and a good life. I have been waiting here for 2 years. A month ago, a letter finally reached me. They died of river fever on the Platte. There is nothing left for me back east, and nothing for me here either. I am old now, and my lungs are failing. I do not think I will survive another winter in this place. I leave what I have here. It was meant for my family. If you have found this shelter, perhaps you are in need of it as I once was. Use it to build a life. Do not let it be for nothing. The locket holds a sketch of my Anna. She was a good woman." Elspeth sank back on her heels, the letter shaking in her hand. The silence of the burrow was profound. She felt the presence of this man, this stranger from another time, his grief and his hope echoing in the small, dark space. He had built this shelter for a family that never came, and now, a generation later, another family had found it. She slowly opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, exquisitely detailed pencil drawing of a young woman with a kind, gentle face. A tear, hot and unexpected, fell from Elspeth's eye and landed on the faded paper. It was not a tear of sadness for herself, but of a deep, resonant sorrow for Elias Vance, and a powerful, overwhelming wave of gratitude. He had left behind more than gold. He had left behind a blessing. His loss had become her improbable salvation. The discovery of the cash changed everything. It was not just the material wealth, but the sudden, powerful infusion of hope. She was no longer just a survivor, clinging to the edge of existence. She was a builder, with the means to create a proper home. The first priority was to get real supplies. The nearest place of trade, according to the maps Thomas had once shown her, was a trading post called 3 Creeks, a hard 2-day walk to the south. Leaving Samuel alone for that long was unthinkable. She waited for a break in the weather, for one of the rare, clear winter days when the sun was bright and the wind was still. She bundled Samuel so thoroughly in the wool blanket and furs that only the tip of his nose was visible. and securing him tightly to her chest, she set out. The journey was arduous. The snow was deep in places, and the cold was relentless. But the gold dust in her pouch was a tangible weight of purpose, and it drove her forward. Three Creeks was little more than a single long log building and a few outbuildings, its chimney puffing a welcome plume of smoke into the vast white landscape. The proprietor was a man named Jedediah Croft, a barrel-chested man with a thick gray beard and shrewd, watchful eyes. He looked at her and the bundle on her chest with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A lone woman with a baby in the middle of winter was an anomaly, and anomalies were often trouble. Elspeth said nothing of her circumstances. She simply unwrapped a small portion of her gold dust onto his counter. "I need to trade," she said, her voice steady. Croft examined the dust, weighing it on a small brass scale. He grunted, his expression unreadable. "What do you need?" She had made a careful list in her head. She needed tools, first and foremost. A good axe, a small shovel, a hammer, and nails. She needed a small cast-iron stove, the kind used in line shacks and shepherd's wagons, and she needed food that would last. Flour, salt, coffee, beans, and a side of salt pork. Croft listened to her list, his eyes moving from her face to the gold dust and back again. He was a fair man, if not a friendly one, and the weight of her gold was honest. He began to gather the items, his movements efficient and practiced. He found her a used but sturdy stove, its iron belly promising a world of warmth. He sold her a sharp, well-balanced axe head, which she would have to haft herself. The load was heavy, far too much to carry in one trip. She arranged to leave the stove and the bulk of the supplies, taking only what she could manage on a makeshift sledge she built from branches and hide. As she left, Croft spoke to her for the first time with something other than business. "That's a hard trail in this weather," he said, nodding toward the north. "Watch for drifts." It was not kindness, precisely, but it was an acknowledgement of her struggle, and for that, she was grateful. The journey back was a triumph. The weight of the axe head and the flour on her sledge was the most beautiful burden she had ever carried. Back in her burrow, she set to work with renewed energy. She found a straight, strong length of ash, and using Silas's knife and a heated rock, painstakingly carved and fitted a handle for the axe. The feel of the completed tool in her hands was a revelation. With it, she could fell small trees, chop firewood, and begin to properly shore up her home. She cut timbers to brace the entrance of the burrow, creating a short, sturdy tunnel that would keep the snow from drifting in. She built a rough but functional door from split logs, chinked with clay and moss. The second trip to Three Creeks to retrieve the stove was even more difficult, but the thought of its warmth was a powerful motivator. Dragging the heavy iron stove on her sledge through the snow was the hardest physical task of her life. But when she finally got it back and settled it into its place in the corner of her burrow, the feeling of accomplishment was profound. She had no proper stovepipe, so her first task was to find a way to vent the smoke. She carefully dug a narrow chimney flue up through the dirt ceiling, lining it with flat stones mortared together with wet clay. It was a smoky, imperfect solution, but it worked. That night, for the first time, she lit a fire in the stove. The small iron box began to radiate a deep, steady heat that filled the entire space. The damp chill that had lived in her bones for months began to recede. She sat on her pine bough bed, nursing Samuel in the warm, flickering light, and felt a sense of security so complete it was almost overwhelming. She was warm, she was fed, and she was safe. Her burrow was becoming a home. Her smoke did not go unnoticed. In a landscape so vast and empty, a thin column of wood smoke was a signal, a sign of human life. A week after she installed the stove, she was outside splitting wood when she saw a figure on horseback approaching from the east. Her first instinct was fear, a tightening in her gut. But the rider was a woman, and she rode not with haste, but with a slow, deliberate pace. The woman dismounted a short distance from the burrow and walked toward her, carrying a covered basket. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with a face mapped by sun and hardship, but her eyes were kind. "I'm Mary O'Connell," she said, her voice gentle. "My homestead is over the next ridge. I saw your smoke and thought you might be in need of company." Elspeth, who had not had a real conversation with another person in months, could only nod, her throat tight. Mary looked at the burrow's entrance, at the neat stack of firewood, at the small, determined woman with an axe in her hand, and her expression softened with understanding. She did not ask questions. She simply lifted the cloth from her basket. "I brought some stew," she said, "and a bit of fresh milk, if your little one is old enough." That simple act of kindness, the offering of a warm meal without condition or question, broke through the wall Elspeth had built around herself. She invited Mary inside, and the older woman marveled at the cozy, well-ordered space she had carved from the earth. They sat by the stove, and while Samuel slept, Elspeth found herself telling her story, the words pouring out in a quiet, steady stream. Mary listened patiently, her presence a comforting warmth in the small room. From that day on, Mary became a regular visitor, a lifeline to the human world. She would bring supplies, news, and the simple gift of her time. She taught Elspeth how to make a proper sourdough starter and how to mend clothes with stitches that were nearly invisible. In return, Elspeth shared her firewood and offered her skills in tanning the hides of the rabbits she snared. A quiet friendship formed, built not on shared sentiment, but on a foundation of mutual respect and practical support. Through Mary, Elspeth learned she needed a proper stovepipe and door hinges if she was to be truly secure. Mary told her of Abner Finch, the blacksmith at Three Creeks, a man known for his skill and his taciturn nature. On her next trip for supplies, Elspeth sought him out. Abner was a tall, lean man with soot permanently etched into the lines of his hands. He listened to her request for a stovepipe and hinges, his gaze direct and serious. He asked for the precise measurements, which she provided, scratched onto a piece of bark. He nodded. "Come back in 2 days." When she returned, he had forged a perfect set of hinges and a sturdy, well-seamed pipe, the craftsmanship evident in every detail. He charged her a fair price in gold dust, and as she left, he added, "A good door keeps the winter out, but a good neighbor lets the spring in." It was the most he had ever said at one time, and the words stayed with her. A piece of simple, hard-won wisdom. Winter tightened its grip on the high country. The snows fell deeper, and the temperatures plummeted, staying below freezing for weeks on end. News, brought by Mary or the occasional trapper passing through Three Creeks, told of a brutal season. Cattle were freezing to death in the fields, and more than one homesteader had been caught in a blizzard and lost. 40 men, it was said, had died across the territory from exposure, starvation, or accidents in the deep snow. But in her burrow, Elspeth and her son were safe. The little stove kept the small space warm and dry. Her larder was stocked with flour, beans, and salted meat. She had a good supply of firewood stacked just outside her door. The rhythms of their life were simple and quiet. She would wake before dawn, stoke the fire, and make coffee. She would nurse Samuel, his growing body a constant, wondrous affirmation of life. During the day, she worked. She checked her snare lines, skinned and prepared the rabbits she caught, and scraped and tanned their hides. She improved the burrow, adding a small carved wooden shelf and smoothing the walls with a final layer of clay. In the long, dark evenings, by the light of a tallow lamp, she would take out Silas's knife and a piece of cottonwood and carve. She carved small, intricate figures of birds and animals, her hands remembering the lessons of the old trapper. The focused, repetitive work was a kind of meditation, a way of ordering the world into a shape she could understand. She was no longer just the cast-out daughter of Josiah Cain. She was a woman who could read the weather in the sky, who could build a door and set a snare, who could turn a piece of wood into a living thing. She was the mother of Samuel, a healthy, thriving boy who was beginning to smile and coo in his sleep. She became a known, if enigmatic, part of the small, scattered community. Jedediah at the trading post called her the Creek Woman and began setting aside small things he thought she might need. Abner the blacksmith fashioned her a small, sharp blade for her fine carving work, asking for nothing in return. Mary O'Connell became like an aunt to Samuel, her visits a source of joy and comfort. They did not pry into her past. They simply accepted her as she was, a quiet, capable woman who had made a home in an impossible place. Her life was not easy, but it was her own. It was a life built not on the rigid doctrines of her father, but on the practical, honest truths of the earth and the quiet, steady kindness of strangers. The burrow was more than a shelter. It was a testament. It was proof that a life could be built from what others had abandoned, that a home could be found in the wreckage of a loss. As the days began to lengthen and the iron-hard grip of winter started to soften, Elspeth would sometimes sit at the entrance of her burrow in the late afternoon, watching the light change on the snow-covered hills. The world was still white and frozen, but there was a new promise in the air, a subtle shift in the angle of the sun. Samuel would be sleeping soundly inside, wrapped in a soft, rabbit fur blanket she had made for him. In these quiet moments, her thoughts would often drift. She would think of her family, of the cold, hard house she had left behind. There was a dull ache there, a sadness for the love she had never been given. But it was no longer a sharp, open wound. It was a scar, a part of her history, but it did not define her present. She would take out the two objects she kept in a small wooden box she had carved. One was the horn-handled knife from Silas Blackwood, its blade worn smooth with use, its handle gleaming with the patina of her own hand. The other was the small silver locket from Elias Vance, the kind face of his lost Anna still visible within. She would hold one in each hand, feeling their weight and their history. Silas, the man who had taught her how to survive, who had given her the skills to be self-reliant. Elias, the man who had provided her with the means, whose long-ago grief had become her foundation. They were two strangers, two lonely men who had shown her more care and provided more for her future than her own father ever had. They were her true ancestors, her spiritual kin. Their legacy was not one of blood or name, but of practical grace. One had given her knowledge, the other a home. In this small burrow, dug into the side of a frozen creek, the lives of these three solitary people, Elspeth, Silas, and Elias, had converged across time to create a place of safety and warmth for a small, innocent child. She looked at her hands, no longer the soft, unblemished hands of a girl, but the strong, calloused hands of a woman who knew how to work, how to build, how to endure. She had not merely survived the winter, she had prevailed. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into the best thing she had ever had. A life of her own making, a home filled with peace, and a future for her son. Elspeth was 18 and a mother. She had been cast out with nothing, and she had built a home from the frozen earth. It was the best life she had ever known. This story reminds us that home is not always a place we are given, but often a place we must build for ourselves, sometimes from the most unexpected materials. If you were moved by Elspeth's journey, please consider sharing her story with someone who might find strength in it. And now, a question for you to reflect on. What have you built from something that was broken or left behind in your own life? What would you do if the only thing you could afford was a memory everyone else had tried to forget? What if you traded your last dollars not for a home, but for a ruin, a pile of stones that the world had already dismissed as worthless? They said she was a fool, trading good money for bad ground. But the truth waiting inside those crumbling walls was a secret the entire valley had forgotten how to hear. Stay close now, and find a quiet place to settle in. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, as we tell the story of Ilara Vance and the forgotten ruin on Whisperwind Ridge. Ilara Vance arrived in the town of Redemption Creek with little more than the dust on her coat, and a silence that had settled deep in her bones. The wagon she drove was borrowed, the sway-backed mule pulling it was her own, and the grief she carried was a private, heavy stone. It had been 10 years since she'd left this valley, a bride following her husband, Caleb, toward a promise of richer soil in the west. Now she was back, a widow. The rich soil had taken him, claimed by a fever that burned through their small homestead like a prairie fire, leaving nothing but ash and memory. She had sold what little was left, enough for a train ticket east and the purchase of the old mule, Gideon, who seemed to carry a weariness that matched her own. The town hadn't changed. The main street was still a river of dust, flanked by the same false-fronted buildings. The mercantile, the saloon, the land office, the smithy. Faces turned as her wagon creaked past. She saw whispers form on lips that had once wished her well. They saw the tired mule, the worn dress, the absence of the smiling man who had ridden out with her. They saw failure. Ilara kept her eyes fixed forward on the raw blue line of the mountains that cradled the valley. That was the only thing that felt like coming home. Her family was long gone, buried in the small churchyard on the edge of town, leaving her with no anchor but the land itself. Her only stop was to see Jedediah Croft, an old friend of her father's who ran the livery. He was a man made of leather and kindness, his face a map of long years under a hard sun. He took Gideon's reins without a word, his eyes holding a gentle sorrow that needed no explanation. "Heard you were coming back, Ilara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard about Caleb. I'm sorry for it." She just nodded, unable to form the words. The knot in her throat was a constant companion. "You need a place to stay?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I need a place to own," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. "Something small, something quiet." Jedediah wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze drifting up toward the high ridges that walled in the valley to the north. Not much left that's small or quiet. Silas Blackwoods bought up most everything in the lowlands, consolidating. The name fell like a stone in the dusty air. Blackwood. She remembered him as a boy, loud and boastful, always taking what wasn't his. It seemed some things grew, but never changed. "What about higher up?" she asked. "On the ridges?" Jedediah frowned. "Nothing up there but rock and wind, and the old McCready place, I suppose. Though you can't call it a place anymore, more a pile of stones." He paused. They call it the widow's folly now. Been sitting empty 30 years. No one's wanted it. A memory surfaced, faint and gray, of her father pointing up at a distant chimney stack on the ridge, telling a story about a reclusive old man who talked to plants. A place forgotten. A place no one wanted. It sounded like a mirror of herself. "Is it for sale?" she asked. Jedediah looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fragile steel beneath the exhaustion. He saw she wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for a place to make a final stand. Deeds in the land office. Been there for decades. Sheriff holds it for taxes, costs next to nothing. But Alara, it's nothing. The ground is thin. The well went dry. The wind'll peel the skin from your bones in winter. "I'll take a look at it," she said, her decision already made. The idea of it, a place of stone and wind, felt right. Soil had betrayed her. It had taken everything. Maybe it was time to build on rock. She thanked Jedediah. Her first real words, spoken with a sliver of newfound purpose. He offered her the use of the wagon for another day, a quiet act of faith in a woman everyone else was ready to write off. As she walked toward the land office, the whispers of the town followed her like ghosts, murmuring about the poor Vance girl, back with nothing, now aiming to buy nothing. She felt their pity and their judgment. But for the first time in months, she also felt the faint, unfamiliar flicker of a path forward, a path leading up, away from the soft, fertile ground that had become her graveyard. The path led to stone. The man in the land office, a clerk with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, peered at her over his spectacles when she stated her purpose. "The McCready place?" he asked, a small, superior smile touching his lips. "Ma'am, are you sure? There's a reason it sat for 30 years. He pulled a dusty ledger from a high shelf, blowing a cloud of neglect from its cover. "Here it is. Lot 74, Whisperwind Ridge. 16 acres, one stone structure, condition, derelict." He ran a finger down the page. Tax deed. $50. $50 was nearly all she had left in the world. It was the sum total of her failed life in the West, the ghost of 1,000 acres of wheat, of a sturdy farmhouse, of a future. She laid the money on the counter. The worn bills were a testament to her loss. The clerk counted them slowly, as if surprised they were real. He filled out the deed with a flourish, the scratch of his pen loud in the silent room. As he handed her the paper, he couldn't help but add, "Silas Blackwood offered 10 for it last year. Said he'd use the stones for a new wall. You've paid 5 times what it's worth." Alara took the deed, the paper cool and official in her hand. It felt heavier than a simple document. It felt like a wager against the world. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her bodice, the paper resting against her skin like a promise or a prayer. Outside, the sun was bright, making her blink. The town seemed to hold its breath as she walked back toward the livery, the news of her purchase traveling faster than she did. Men standing outside the saloon stopped talking. Women in the mercantile parted the curtains to watch her pass. They saw a woman buying a ghost, a forgotten ruin on a god-forsaken ridge. They saw a fool. What they couldn't see was the flicker of hope in her, the desperate need for a place so broken that no one could hurt her there, a place where the only thing left to do was build. She had her deed. She had her mule. She had a pile of stones waiting for her on a windy ridge. It was, for the first time in a long time, a beginning. What was she thinking? Trading everything for a ruin. Was it desperation, or did some deeper instinct guide her hand? What secret could a pile of forgotten stones possibly hold that an entire valley had overlooked for 30 years? Let us know what you think in the comments below. and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden treasures and quiet triumphs. Now, with the deed in hand, Elara Vance had to face the reality of what she had just bought. The mockery wasn't long in coming. As Elara loaded a few meager supplies into the wagon at the mercantile, a sack of flour, beans, salt, a new axe head, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were spoken just loud enough for her to hear. $50 for that pile of rocks. One man chuckled to another over a barrel of pickles. She'll be back down before the first snow, begging for a room. The store owner, a man named Henderson, gave her a look of pity as he tallied her bill. "It's a hard place up there, miss," he said, his voice laced with a condescending kindness she found more grating than open scorn. "The wind never stops." Elara simply paid her bill, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. Each word was a small stone being thrown at her, and she was already weary from the weight of them. As she was tying the last of her provisions down, a shadow fell over the wagon. She looked up to see Silas Blackwood astride a magnificent black stallion, the leather of his saddle creaking with expensive authority. He was a big man, his face ruddy with sun and self-satisfaction. He looked down at her, his gaze sweeping over her worn dress and the tired mule with open contempt. "Vance," he said, the name a dismissal. "I hear you bought the old Macready rubble." Elara met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence seemed to irritate him. "I offered the county $10 for that plot," he boomed, for the benefit of anyone listening. "Just for the stone. You paid $50. You know what that tells me?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "It tells me you've got more grief than sense. That ridge is useless. The water's gone, the soil's bare. You'll starve or freeze before spring." He smirked. "When you're ready to admit your mistake, I'll give you $5 for the deed. Save you the trouble of climbing down." He expected a response, a protest, an argument, tears. He got none. Elara finished checking her knot and turned to Gideon, stroking the mule's coarse neck. The animal let out a long, slow breath, as if mirroring her own forced patience. Blackwood's face tightened. Her refusal to engage him was an insult he couldn't quite grasp. With a sharp tug on his reins, he wheeled the stallion around, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over her and the wagon. "Have fun with your kingdom of rocks, widow," he called over his shoulder, his laughter echoing down the street. She stood there for a moment, the dust settling in her hair, the laughter ringing in her ears. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. It would have been so easy to give in, to feel the shame they all wanted her to feel. Instead, a cold, hard anger began to burn away the fog of her grief. They saw a weak, broken woman. She would have to show them something else. As she prepared to climb onto the wagon seat, a soft voice stopped her. "The stone remembers what the soil forgets." Elara turned. An old woman sat on a bench in the shade of the land office, her face a beautiful, intricate web of wrinkles. She was wrapped in a dark blanket, though the day was warm. Elara recognized her as Alma, a native woman who lived alone in the foothills and rarely came to town. Her eyes were dark and clear, and they looked at Elara not with pity, but with a strange, knowing intensity. "I'm sorry?" Elara asked, stepping closer. Alma did not repeat herself. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the high northern ridge. "Some roots don't need water," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They need stone." And then she looked away, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the dusty street, her audience with Elara clearly over. The words made no sense, yet they settled in Elara's mind, feeling less like a riddle and more like a blessing. The stone remembers. It was the second time she'd heard an idea like that. first from her father's ghost memory, now from this woman. Shaking her head, as if to clear it, Ilara climbed onto the wagon. She clucked to Gideon, and the old mule leaned into his harness. The wagon groaned and began to roll, leaving the town, its scorn, and its strange, cryptic prophecy behind. The road ahead led up. The journey to Whisperwind Ridge was a slow, arduous climb. The road, little more than a pair of rutted tracks, quickly left the fertile valley floor behind, winding its way up through sparse pine and juniper. The air grew thinner, cooler. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding rhythm of Gideon's hooves, and the rising voice of the wind. It was a constant, pressing thing, this wind. It streamed through the pines with a mournful sigh, tugged at the canvas cover of the wagon, and whipped loose strands of hair across Ilara's face. Henderson had been right. The wind never stopped. Gideon, patient as a saint, leaned into the incline, his breath coming in steady, white puffs. Ilara felt a deep kinship with the animal. They were two tired creatures, pulling a heavy load toward an uncertain destination. By late afternoon, they reached the turnoff described on the deed. It was barely a path, overgrown with sage and thistle. She had to get down twice to drag fallen branches out of the way. The wagon jolted and swayed over the uneven ground, and Ilara held the reins tight, her knuckles white. The ridge was higher than she'd thought, a spine of granite thrusting up toward the sky. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western mountains, casting long, distorted shadows that made the landscape feel alien and alive. Finally, through a stand of gnarled, wind-stunted pines, she saw it, the ruin. It was less a cabin and more a suggestion of one. 4 low, crumbling stone walls stood defiant against the sky, but the roof was entirely gone, its timbers having long ago collapsed inward to create a chaotic jumble of splintered wood and debris. The chimney stack, which she'd seen from the valley, stood tall at one end, a grim, solitary finger pointing at the heavens. There was no door, only a dark, gaping hole. The windows were empty eyes. The 16 acres of land were not a field, but a slope of rock and thin, pale soil, choked with weeds and thorny bushes. A single ancient oak tree grew near the ruin, its branches twisted and tormented into fantastic shapes by the relentless wind. Jedediah had not exaggerated. Blackwood had not lied. It was nothing. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over Ilara. The anger that had fueled her climb from the town guttered and died, leaving only the hollow ache of a profound mistake. $50. She had spent her entire world on this pile of stones. The wind howled around the corners of the ruin, a sound of pure desolation. It was a place where things came to die, not to be reborn. She brought Gideon to a halt and slid wearily from the wagon seat. Her legs were stiff, her body sore. The mule lowered his head and stood motionless, as if he, too, were taking in the scale of their folly. Ilara walked slowly toward the cabin, her boots crunching on gravel and dried weeds. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone. She stopped at the threshold, the gaping hole that was once a doorway. Inside, the last of the day's light illuminated a scene of total decay. The floor was a mess of rotted wood, fallen stone, and dirt. Weeds grew up through the cracks. In the center of the room, the collapsed roof beams lay like the bones of some great, fallen beast. At the far end was the fireplace, a massive hearth of dark, soot-stained granite filled with rubble. It was worse than she could have imagined. This wasn't a home waiting for repair. It was a grave. The weight of her journey, her grief, and now this crushing disappointment pressed down on her. She leaned against the cold stone of the doorframe, the rough surface biting into her palm. Tears she had refused to shed in front of the town now burned behind her eyes. She had come here seeking refuge, a place to build. Instead, she had found the end of the line. The sun sank below the mountains, and the world was plunged into a deep purple twilight. The wind picked up, moaning through the empty windows. That night, she didn't even try to go inside. She unhitched Gideon, giving him his small ration of oats, and made her own cold camp in the lee of the wagon. She wrapped herself in her bedroll, listening to the lonely sounds of the ridge, the stones of her new home whispering of failure in the dark. That first night on the ridge was long and cold. Ilara slept fitfully, huddled in her bedroll, the constant sighing wind a restless companion. She woke before dawn, the sky a pale, bruised gray to the east. Every muscle ached. The despair of the previous evening had settled into a hard, dense knot in her stomach. For a long moment, she considered Blackwood's mocking offer. She could pack up, lead Gideon back down the mountain, and take his $5. She could swallow her pride and beg for work, for charity. The thought was so bitter, it was a physical taste in her mouth. She looked at the ruin, a dark silhouette against the growing light. It was hers. A failure, perhaps, but her failure. To turn back now would be to admit that Blackwood and the town were right, that she was nothing more than the broken widow they saw. With a resolve born of pure stubbornness, she rose. She built a small fire, boiled water for coffee, and ate a piece of dry bread. The simple ritual was grounding. Gideon watched her, his large, dark eyes patient. After she had eaten, she walked back to the cabin. In the clear, unforgiving light of morning, it looked even more hopeless. But today, she would not be defeated by the sight of it. Today, she would work. She had to start somewhere. The roof seemed impossible, the walls unstable. The floor was the only place to begin. She took her new axe, a pry bar, and a heavy pair of work gloves from the wagon. Her plan was simple. Clear the debris. Pull out the rotten timbers. Haul away the fallen stones. Get down to whatever was left of the original floor. It was brutal, punishing labor. The collapsed roof timbers were heavy and tangled, wedged together in a chaotic mess. She used the pry bar to lever them apart, the axe to chop through the most stubborn pieces. Splinters dug into her gloves. Her shoulders and back screamed in protest. She worked in a grim, methodical rhythm, dragging one piece of wood at a time out of the cabin and into a pile. By midday, she had cleared a small section near the door, revealing patches of the original flagstone floor underneath inches of dirt and rubble. She was sweat-soaked and covered in grime, but a small patch of solid ground was visible. It was the first victory, however small. She kept on, moving deeper into the single large room. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand. The next beam, the next pile of rubble. The world shrank to the space within those 4 stone walls. The town, her grief, her past. It all receded, replaced by the satisfying ache of physical exertion. As the afternoon wore on, she worked her way toward the great stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. It was choked with debris from the collapsed chimney and years of neglect. Soot and crumbled mortar covered everything. She began to haul out the larger pieces of fallen rock, tossing them onto a pile outside. Then she used a shovel to start clearing the smaller rubble and ash from the hearth itself. It was packed solid. As she dug, her shovel struck something that wasn't loose rock. It made a dull, clinking sound. Curious, she knelt down and began to clear the debris with her hands. Buried deep in the compacted ash and dirt at the very back of the hearth, nestled against the fireback, was a single, smooth stone. It was unlike the rough gray granite of the fireplace. This stone was dark, almost black. But when she turned it in the light, it shimmered with veins of an astonishing, deep blue-green, the color of a peacock's feather or a distant nebula. It was perfectly smooth, shaped like a large egg, and felt strangely dense and cool in her palm. It didn't belong here. The fireplace was made of local stone, quarried from the ridge. This was something else entirely, something foreign. She stood up, wiping the soot from the stone with her glove. It was beautiful, in a strange, quiet way, an anomaly. Why would it be here, tucked away in the back of a fireplace? Was it a good luck charm? A child's forgotten toy? A decorative piece left by the mysterious Mr. Macready? She had no answers. It was just a pretty rock. She was about to toss it onto the stone pile outside when she hesitated. Something about it felt special. It was the first beautiful thing she had found in this place of decay. On an impulse, she slipped it into the pocket of her dress. It felt heavy and solid against her leg, a small, secret discovery. She didn't understand it. She didn't know what it meant. But as she turned back to the half-cleared room, the ruin no longer seemed quite so hopeless. It now held a question, and a single, beautiful, out-of-place stone. Days turned into a week, and the week bled into a month. Ilara's life found a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the sheer scope of the work. Every morning she rose, tended to Gideon, and began her assault on the ruin. The pile of rotten timbers grew, a testament to her labor. She cleared the entire cabin floor, revealing a surprisingly intact flagstone foundation, scarred and stained but solid. Solid. The word echoed in her mind. After the floor was clear, she started on the walls, meticulously checking each stone. Using fresh mortar mixed with clay and water from a small, trickling spring she'd found a quarter-mile down the slope, to fill the gaps the wind had worried open over 30 years. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. The sun browned her skin, and the constant work sculpted lean muscle onto her frame. She was no longer the frail widow who had arrived in the valley. She was becoming a part of the ridge, as weathered and resilient as the ancient pines. Gideon was her constant, silent shadow. The old mule would stand for hours in the shade of the twisted oak, watching her work, his ears occasionally flicking at a fly. His calm, patient presence was a balm. In the evenings, when she was too sore to move, she would sit with him, sharing a piece of an apple, her head resting against his warm, coarse flank. He would let out a low, rumbling sigh, a sound of deep contentment that seemed to say, "We are still here." He was her only friend, the only living creature who asked nothing of her and accepted her completely. Together, they were two solitary beings, holding their ground against a world that had discarded them. As she worked, she found more of the stones. They were not in the cabin walls or the foundation. They were in the earth itself. When she began the back-breaking task of clearing the 16 acres of weeds and thorny brush, her shovel would turn them up. They were never on the surface, always a foot or two down, nestled in the thin, rocky soil like sleeping things. Most were smaller than the first one she'd found, the size of a robin's egg or a thumb. But they all had the same strange density and the same mesmerizing blue-green veins. They were scattered randomly across the entire plot of land. At first she collected them, piling them neatly on the stone wall she was rebuilding. They were a curiosity, a small mystery. But as their numbers grew, so did her puzzlement. This wasn't a random scattering. There were too many of them. It felt intentional, like seeds sown in the ground. Remembering Alma's words, some roots don't need water, they need stone. Ilara began to pay closer attention to the plants growing near the strange stones. The land looked barren, choked with thistle and scrub. But where the blue-green stones were most numerous, she noticed a different kind of plant growing. It was a low, hardy herb with silvery green leaves and a tiny, deep purple flower. It didn't grow anywhere else on the ridge, only in the pockets of soil where the strange stones lay buried. When she crushed a leaf between her fingers, it released a sharp, clean scent, like mint and pine and something else. something medicinal. She didn't recognize it. It was another piece of the puzzle, another question without an answer. The stones and the herb seemed connected, a secret conversation happening in the soil beneath her feet. Her hands, through the simple act of clearing the land, were learning something her mind had not yet grasped. The work was no longer just about rebuilding a shelter. It was an investigation. Each shovelful of earth, each stone pulled from the wall, was a question posed to the silent, forgotten history of the place. And slowly, the land was beginning to offer up its clues. One afternoon, while repairing the flagstone floor near the hearth, her pry bar slipped between two stones and hit something that wasn't earth. It clanged with the hollow sound of metal. Her heart gave a small, quick beat. She worked the pry bar back into the gap and levered up one of the heavy flagstones. It came loose with a grating groan, releasing the scent of damp, trapped earth. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, and nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly rotted away, was a small tin box, rusted but intact. It was a document box, the kind a person might use to keep important papers safe from fire or flood. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it outside into the late afternoon light and sat on the low wall she had just finished rebuilding. Gideon, seeing the break in her routine, ambled over and nudged her shoulder with his soft nose. She pried the rusted lid open. Inside, preserved in the dry, sealed environment, was a leather-bound journal, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and several small, meticulously labeled paper packets. She picked up the journal first. The leather was stiff, the pages brittle. On the first page, in a neat, elegant script, was a name: Alistair Macready, botanist. Year of our Lord, 1851. Alistair Macready, the man her father had called a hermit who talked to plants. He was a botanist, a scientist. Ilara opened the journal and began to read. The world around her, the wind, the setting sun, the patient mule, faded away. She was transported back 30 years into the mind of the man who had built this place. He was not a hermit. He was a researcher. He had come to this valley not for gold or land, but for its unique geology. The journal was filled with detailed observations, sketches of rock formations, and complex chemical notations. He wrote of his search for a specific, rare mineral composite he called Petra caerulea, or the blue stone. He believed it held unique properties that could enrich soil in a way no other substance could. He had found it here, on this ridge. The blue-green stones, her stones. They were not just pretty rocks. According to Macready's notes, they were incredibly rich in copper, cobalt, and a dozen other trace minerals, a combination found nowhere else he had studied. He theorized that these minerals, when slowly released into the soil, could support plant life that would otherwise perish in such thin, arid ground. He wasn't just building a cabin, he was building a laboratory. This entire 16-acre plot was his experiment. Ilara's hands shook as she turned the pages. The journal then shifted from geology to botany. Macready had traveled the world collecting seeds of rare, hardy, and medicinal plants. Plants that thrived in the Andes, the Himalayas, the driest deserts. His goal was to see if they could be cultivated here, in the unique soil of his stone garden. She picked up one of the small paper packets. On it was written, Rhodiola crenulata, Tibetan highlands, resilient to frost and drought, a powerful adaptogen. Inside were tiny dark seeds. Another packet read, Salvia dori, Great Basin, purple sage, brewed for fevers and lung ailments. The silvery-leafed herb with the purple flower. It was growing all over her land. It wasn't a weed, it was a crop. Macready had succeeded. He had cultivated a garden of priceless, resilient medicinal herbs on this barren ridge. The letters told the final, sad part of the story. They were from his sister, begging him to come home. His funding from a distant university had run out, and his work was being dismissed as eccentric folly. The last letter was returned, marked deceased. He had died up here, alone, his work unfinished and unrecognized. Ilara looked up from the journal, her eyes blurred with tears. She looked at the rocky slope, the scattered patches of silver-leafed herbs, the pile of blue-green stones. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a folly. It was a legacy. A secret garden, waiting for someone patient enough to listen to the ground. She, a woman who had lost everything to the soil, had inherited a place where stones gave life. She looked at Gideon, and for the first time in a year, a genuine smile touched her lips. She knew what she had to do. The discovery changed everything. The work was no longer a fight against the land, but a partnership with it. Following the faded maps in Macready's journal, Ilara began to work with a new purpose. She wasn't just clearing land. She was tending a garden. She built low stone terraces to prevent erosion, just as his notes suggested. She carefully transplanted the wild purple sage, giving it room to breathe. She found the small, trickling spring he had documented and cleared a channel to direct its meager flow toward the most promising beds. Her days were still filled with hard labor, but now it was joyful, creative work. She felt the ghost of Alistair Macready at her side, a silent, encouraging presence. She was not just rebuilding his home, she was completing his life's work. Autumn arrived, painting the valley below in hues of gold and amber. On the ridge, the wind grew teeth. The nights were sharp with the coming frost. Ilara had managed to repair a section of the roof over one corner of the cabin, creating a small, dry space for her to sleep, her supplies, and Macready's precious journal. It wasn't much, but it was a home. She worked frantically, harvesting the seeds from the purple sage, drying the leaves, and storing them as the journal instructed. She was racing against the winter. One afternoon, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The wind died down to an unnerving stillness. Gideon grew restless, pacing and sniffing the air, his ears flat against his head. Ilara had seen a sky like this once before. It meant a blizzard was coming. A bad one, and early. She scrambled to secure the cabin, banking the fire and bringing Gideon into the unfinished main room, sheltering him from the worst of what was to come. The snow began just after dusk, not as gentle flakes, but as a driving, horizontal wall of white. The wind returned with a vengeance, shrieking around the stone walls like a banshee. The storm was a physical assault, trying to tear her small sanctuary from the mountainside. Inside, huddled by the fire, Ilara listened to the fury, a profound sense of isolation settling over her. She was utterly alone, trapped on the ridge. Sometime deep in the night, over the roar of the wind, she heard a new sound, a desperate human shout. She grabbed her lantern and fought her way to the doorway, shielding the flame with her body. Through the blinding curtain of snow, she saw a faint, bobbing light far down the trail. Another shout, weaker this time. Someone was out there. Without a second thought for her own safety, she pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a rope around her waist, tied the other end to a support beam inside the cabin, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole her breath. The wind tore at her, and the snow blinded her. Following the faint cries, she fought her way down the path, the rope her only lifeline back to the cabin. She found them 100 yards down the slope. A family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children, huddled against the side of their broken wagon, one of its wheels shattered in a ditch. They were settlers, their clothes thin, their faces blue with cold. The man was trying to shield his family with his own body, but he was fading. "Help," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "I have shelter," Ilara yelled over the wind. "Come with me." With immense effort, she helped the man get his wife and children to their feet. The woman was coughing, a deep rattling sound in her chest, and the youngest child was frighteningly still. Leaning on each other, a small, desperate train of humanity, they followed Ilara's rope back through the screaming storm. Getting them into the cabin was a final, desperate struggle against the wind. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a shock. The family collapsed onto the floor, shivering uncontrollably. The woman, whose name was Sarah, was consumed by a feverish cough. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. Pneumonia, Ilara thought with a sinking heart. The town doctor was a day's ride away in good weather. In this storm, he might as well be on the moon. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then her eyes fell on the tin box. Macready's journal. Salvia Dori. Brewed for fevers and lung ailments. She went to her small store of dried herbs, the purple sage she had so carefully harvested. Her hands steady now, she followed the botanist's instructions, crushing the leaves and steeping them in hot water from the kettle on the fire. The scent, clean and sharp, filled the small room. She held the warm cup to Sarah's lips. "Drink this," she commanded gently. "It will help you breathe." The woman drank, her husband watching with helpless fear in his eyes. Ilara had chosen. She had committed not just to the cabin, not just to the garden, but to the knowledge that had been hidden here. In the heart of the storm, in her kingdom of rocks, she was sheltering strangers, fighting for a life with the forgotten wisdom of a ghost. The blizzard raged for 2 days and 2 nights, burying the ridge in a deep blanket of white. Inside the small, fire-lit corner of the cabin, Ilara tended to the stranded family. She brewed the purple sage tea for Sarah every few hours, the sharp, medicinal steam a constant presence in the air. She shared her meager stores of food, stew made from beans and dried vegetables, flatbread cooked on a hot stone by the fire. Slowly, miraculously, Sarah's fever began to recede. The rattling in her chest eased, and her breathing grew deeper, more regular. The children, wrapped in Ilara's spare blankets, regained their warmth and their spirit. The man, Thomas, watched Ilara with a look of quiet awe, his initial fear replaced by a profound, unspoken gratitude. He saw not a strange recluse, but a savior. He saw the strength in her hands, the calm in her eyes, the quiet competence with which she moved about her stone shelter. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, the world was transformed. The sun shone on a landscape of pristine, silent white. The valley below was hidden under a sea of clouds. It was as if the ridge were an island in the sky. Thomas, his strength returned, helped Ilara dig a path out of the cabin. "We owe you our lives," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Ilara said simply. "You were in need." It took another day for the snow to melt enough for travel to be safe. Thomas, a capable carpenter, spent the time helping Ilara brace the damaged roof timbers, his way of offering thanks. When it was time for them to leave, Sarah, now steady on her feet, embraced her. "That tea," she said, her hand on her chest. "It was like a miracle. What was it?" "An old remedy," Ilara replied, glancing toward the journal. "From the mountain." The family made their way down to Redemption Creek, leaving Ilara once more in the silence of her ridge, the quiet broken only by Gideon's soft chewing. The story they told in town, however, was anything but quiet. They spoke of a blizzard that nearly took them, a broken wagon, and the woman on Whisperwind Ridge who had saved them. They told of her stone cabin, a sanctuary in the storm, and of a miraculous herb that had cured a deadly lung fever. The townspeople, who had mocked Ilara for her folly, listened in stunned silence. The laughter died in their throats. A week later, a rider made his way up the winding path to the ridge. It was Dr. Adams, the town's physician, a thoughtful, educated man in his 50s. He found Ilara tending her terraced beds, clearing away the last of the snow. "Miss Vance," he said, dismounting, "I heard a remarkable story in town, about the Sawyer family." Ilara nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "They were caught in the storm." "They said you treated Mrs. Sawyer's pneumonia with an herb," he said, his eyes full of professional curiosity. "May I ask what it was?" Instead of answering directly, Ilara invited him inside. She showed him the dried leaves of the purple sage. She showed him Macready's journal, the detailed notes, the careful sketches. Dr. Adams sat at her rough-hewn table for over an hour, turning the brittle pages with reverent hands. He read about the Petra caerulea, the blue stones, and the garden of resilient medicinal plants. He looked at the samples Ilara had collected, his initial skepticism melting into sheer astonishment. "My God," he murmured, looking up at her, his expression one of deep respect. This is the work of a genius. Alistair Macready. I've read his early papers. He was dismissed as a crank, but he was right." He looked around the cabin, at the neatly stacked herbs, the organized seed packets. "And you, Miss Vance, you've brought it all back to life." He confirmed everything she had come to believe. The purple sage was a known, if rare, anti-inflammatory. The Tibetan rhodiola was a legendary tonic for strength and resilience. The other plants described in the journal were a veritable pharmacopoeia, a treasure trove of remedies perfectly suited for a remote community. The barren plot of land was one of the most valuable gardens he had ever seen. Word of the doctor's visit and his validation spread through the valley like wildfire. The narrative had shifted. The widow's folly was no longer a joke. It was a place of wonder. People began to look up at the ridge not with scorn, but with a new reverence. Even Silas Blackwood was silenced. That winter was hard, and a blight swept through the cattle herds in the lowlands. His own prize-winning bull fell ill. Humbled, he sent a ranch hand up the mountain with a silent request for help. Ilara, without a word of triumph, sent back a poultice made from another of Macready's herbs, just as the journal described. The bull recovered. Blackwood never laughed at her again. The following spring, the ridge came alive. Under Ilara's careful stewardship, the garden flourished. The silvery purple sage grew in thick, fragrant rows on the stone terraces. The Tibetan rhodiola sent up tough, succulent shoots. Dozens of other plants, whose names she now knew by heart, bloomed in a riot of quiet, hardy color. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and damp earth. Dr. Adams became a regular visitor, bringing supplies and taking away carefully measured harvests of herbs to create tonics and remedies for the town. Redemption Creek, once so isolated, now had its own apothecary, thanks to the woman they had scorned. People from neighboring valleys began to make the journey, seeking out the healing plants from Whisperwind Ridge. The path to her cabin, once overgrown and forgotten, became a well-worn trail. Ilara hired Thomas Sawyer to help her finish the cabin. With his skill and her vision, they transformed the ruin into a sturdy, beautiful home. They rebuilt the roof with strong timbers, installed glass in the windows, and hung a solid oak door. The great stone hearth, once a symbol of decay, now radiated warmth and life. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a home, and the center of a thriving enterprise. The town that had once pitied her now depended on her. They saw her not as the failed widow, but as the quiet, determined woman who had listened to the land when no one else would. They called her the healer of Whisperwind Ridge. The name Widow's Folly was forgotten, erased from the valley's memory and replaced by a story of resilience and discovery. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the world in a warm, golden light, Ilara stood on the edge of her highest terrace. Below her, the valley was peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of dusk. Gideon stood beside her, his warm breath fogging in the cool air. The silence was no longer one of loneliness, but of deep, abiding peace. Dr. Adams was with her, finalizing a large order that would supply clinics 2 counties away. He looked out over the thriving terraced gardens, a testament to her tireless work. "You've built something remarkable here, Ilara," he said quietly. "More than Macready himself ever managed. What do you call this place now?" Ilara looked at the blue-green stones that edged the garden beds, shimmering in the last light. She looked at the tough, beautiful plants growing from the rocky soil. She thought of the whispers and the scorn, of the cold despair of her first night, and of the quiet joy of discovery. She placed a hand on Gideon's strong neck, feeling the steady, living warmth of him. "I didn't build a garden," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the entire weight of her journey. "I just learned to listen to the ground. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of this journey." It's a powerful reminder that true value is often hidden right beneath our feet, waiting for a patient hand and a quiet heart. If you were moved by Ilara's story of resilience, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of forgotten history brought back to the light. We'll see you next time.